London is not just some city. Its spirit stands outside of time. Certain places have influenced its citizens. It is not only a setting, but a presence, a character in various films, novels, and poems. My name is Philipp Röttgers, and I search for London's spirit. I think there are two particular ways to explore the powerful and mysterious place that is London: through literature and through walking. Follow me into a secret world. Follow me to London beyond time and place. In this series, I will explore its spirit by walking the city and talking to London enthusiasts. I invite you to join me. Together, we will discover London beyond time and place. This is Talks Beyond Time and Place.
Hello, everybody, to this very first episode of Talks Beyond Time and Place. My name is Philipp Röttgers. My guest today, my first guest ever, and hopefully not my last guest ever, is David Charnick. David is a Londoner. He was born, I'm going to introduce you a little bit. He was born and brought up in Bethnal Green and still lives there, if I'm correct.
That's correct, yes.
And he's a historian, a writer, and a qualified city tour guide. And apart from doing his own charno walks, he's part of Footprints of London, and he's employed as a tutor for tour guiding. So welcome, David.
Thank you very much, Phil.
I mentioned quite a lot of things in the introduction there. And so maybe the best way to start our conversation, our talk, is to ask you, how and when did you decide to become a tour guide?
Oh, it was something that was hanging around, as it were, for a long while. Ever since really my teenage years in the early 1980s, I got the habit of just wandering around and finding places that I hadn't seen before, and picking up lots of information and knowledge and so on. And then later on, I found myself just being effectively a tour guide as I was walking along with people, pointing out, oh, do you know who used to live there, or what happened there, or something like that. And after a while I thought, well, maybe I should get paid for doing this. And so the idea sort of settled in the back of my mind. But it was only when I had to leave full-time work and become self-employed, and I thought, well, this would be a good a good income stream, but also a good way of indulging my interest in research. So that's how it all effectively came about.
You're part of Footprints of London. I mentioned that. Maybe you can tell us a bit about that and how that came together.
Yes, certainly. It's a cooperative of independent tour guides. It was created some years ago, and it was some guides who are qualified City of London guides and City of Westminster guides, and they thought, you know, there's strength in numbers, as it were, and it would be a good platform to promote our work and cooperate, and it's grown from there. And the idea really is that to be a member of Footprints of London, you have to be qualified, you've got to be properly trained, and more importantly, a member of a recognized guiding association, which, apart from other things, brings with it insurance cover. So we are fully covered and fully trained. So that's a sort of guarantee of quality, as it were. So we have over 40 members now, and cover a wide area of London, geographically as well as thematically.
I mean, I did tours with you. You cover a lot of parts of London, but one of your focuses is the East End, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. But I wanted to ask, you had your Footprints of London festival, literary festival, something like that, didn't you, just recently?
That's correct. Every October we have our Literary London Festival. This year, of course, it was rather different because most of the events were online because of the virus. But ordinarily, the festival lasts for a whole month, and we would have one or more tours literally every day in October. Last year, we fielded over 60 different tours within the month. This year, because of the virtual nature of a lot of the tours, it only ran for just over a fortnight, from the 1st to the 18th. Not all our guides are prepared to go online with virtual tours. You know, it is a new discipline, and it takes a lot of experience and an experiment to get to be able to do it in a satisfactory way that will justify charging money for it, to be honest. But also that would satisfy the guide in terms of quality. And because of the restrictions, not everybody feels confident about going out with groups of people.
Yeah, I understand that.
As I say, a smaller selection of tours this year.
But were you satisfied? Were you satisfied with the festival this year? The way it was, the way it worked?
Yes, absolutely. We managed to get tours up literally on every day of the festival. There was one or more tours, and I was able to offer a variety of tours myself, because literature is my speciality. So I do tend to overdo it at this time of year. But no, it was very satisfactory, absolutely. But very different as well, obviously.
Of course. But nevertheless, it seemed to have worked well, and I participated in one or two tours there too. So yeah, I can say I was satisfied. I was happy. But of course, it's different than walking the streets. But yeah. So you basically say you've always been a kind of London historian in a way.
Absolutely, that's correct. Yeah, London's one of those places that it's because it's so old, I think, and therefore there've been so many people there. There are so many stories.
Yeah.
I mean, history, after all, is just what people have done.
Yes.
So the more people you've got over a longer period of time, the more history you have.
Yeah.
So lots of layers of stories.
Can you say what the most maybe surprising fact or most interesting or surprising story that you've heard or learned in all these years? Is there something where you say this was the most extraordinary story I've ever heard or I've ever encountered?
Well, I mean, there were various things, but when I was training to be a city guide in 2012 to 13, I was sort of rather teased because I found an interesting fact about there's a little alleyway behind the Bank of England, and it's called Founders Court. And it was the center of British telecommunications from 1848 through to the early 1900s. And nobody knows because there's nothing there to tell you. But it was where our very first telegraph company, the Electric Telegraph Company, started operations in January 1848, moving from the Strand into the city. And it was so important, the network of communications that they established was so important that when the service was nationalized in the 1868, they were allowed to carry on for 2 more years. And then their network was well established.
Yeah.
And this is a very important fact, especially if you have an interest in engineering, and particularly electrical engineering. But there's nothing there to tell you. And it's just tucked away. It's a little secret alleyway with an entrance to an office block. But that's
now
it.
we know. Now everyone that sees this
Yes.
or hears this can go there and now they know it's there. You do an engineering tour, right? With a focus on engineering. One of your tours.
That's correct. I've got one. I've got 2 more waiting in the background to be developed, but the one I've got is in the city. And it's looking at the relationship between engineering and the city, because there's a lot of engineering that goes on in a modern city, as you can appreciate. And it not only helps the city, but it shapes the city too.
Yeah.
So tunnels, bridges, telecommunications, all these things are part of London's story.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. I mean, you've been doing these tours for quite some time now, and I'm always interested in was there something like the strangest moment ever on a tour, or the strangest thing that you've ever encountered in terms of something strange that happened during a tour, maybe?
Well, I suppose one of the usual strange things that happens is when a drunk passes you. and decides to want to get into the conversation.
Oh yeah.
I had one incident where I was guiding some Italian school children, and we're in the city, and we were at the Guild Hall, which is the administrative heart of the city. And while I was talking to them, a man came over and he started shadowing us all the way down the street. And in the end, I managed to see some policemen, and I had to get them involved to get rid of him.
Yeah.
So you get these curious things happening when you're on the streets. You are, as we say, you're a hostage to fortune. Anything can happen.
Yeah.
I had a bicycle race interrupt one of my tours.
Oh.
Yeah, all sorts of things happen.
Yeah.
And, it is surprising what you get. I suppose the strangest thing that's happened to me on a virtual tour is that one of my customers fell asleep. And
yeah, I've seen this happen. I saw this happen quite a few times now on one or the other tours. If you can see your audience, which I think you see them all the time, probably.
That's right.
Yeah, and someone falling asleep. I've seen that too. But yeah, these things happen.
Well, the thing was, she had her video off, so I didn't know whether she was asleep or not, and everyone else had left, and her screen was still there, and she was muted. And there was no video, and I'm trying to talk to her, and then I unmuted her, and I could hear.
Maybe she's still online. Maybe she's still there.
Oh, she did wake up eventually.
Okay, that's very, very good to hear. So you already mentioned the Italian school class, and I was wondering what kind of people attend your tours? What kind of audience? Londoners, tourists, school classes?
Oh, a variety. I mean, the school children from Italy rather. I've guided school children from Italy and Spain, and at one time from Germany too, through agencies. But when you do ordinary scheduled tours where you just put up the tour for whoever wants to come along, you get a surprising variety of people. One time I was doing my tour to Blackwall and beyond, which is where we start at the West India Docks and go through to the East India Docks. And I actually only had 2 people booked on it, and they were a Swiss couple. And he was really interested in the sea and maritime history and that kind of thing, which I thought at the time was a bit strange for a Swiss person, bearing in mind that Switzerland is landlocked. But
maybe because
he was really into it.
Maybe because of that, because he naturally was not close to the sea, so he was very interested in that. Maybe
quite possible.
Perhaps,
yes, absolutely. Yeah, so you get a wide range of people, but also locals as well, as you say. One of the interesting things about tour guiding is you get someone coming on your tour, especially an East End one.
Yeah.
And you'll get someone who says, well, I've seen that for years and didn't know what it was, or I didn't realize just round the corner from where I live or where I work is something that interesting. And you open up new viewpoints onto where people live or where they work, of course, as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's interesting because I realized I did tours in London with you and with other people, but you never do tours where you live. You never join a tour where in the town where you live or where you work. But yeah, I mean, as I said, you're a Londoner. You were born there. You were raised there. And how do you develop your tours? I mean, I think this is an interesting process.
Well, I mean, obviously you get commissions sometimes, and so you have to do something specific. But if I'm doing something of my own, then obviously it will usually follow an interest of mine. So it'll be like mainly literary, but also I have an interest in crime and the law, and also in philanthropy as well, because they're the 2 sides of human experience, as it were, that reveal most about people and human nature. But I'm also a medievalist by training, so I'm very interested in medieval London and indeed Roman London. So usually an idea will sort of spring up. So you think, oh, well, that could make a good tour. But then you have to take into mind logistics,
Yeah,
where things are.
Yeah.
So sometimes you can do a tour that that will follow geographically, will follow a story.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the Great Fire of London tour that I do will follow the progress of the fire. And I do another tour about Henry VIII becoming the supreme head of the English Church. And we're able to follow that through characters who were involved in the story. And so the story more or less flows chronologically, but you're lucky if that happens.
Right. Yeah.
And then you just essentially look around. You see what there is that could support a tour.
Yeah.
Obviously, as you get to know a place more, so the city, I've guided quite a lot over the years in the city, so I can do that largely in my head. But areas that you're not that familiar with, you need to just wander around, and usually you'll do some preliminary work using Google Street View or something like that, and say, well, what can I see that's here that reflects that story? And
Yeah,
you
but
go on from there.
no, sorry. Yeah, but yeah, I think this is very, very interesting, because I like these kind of you know, I look at the map and I think, how would I, if I were there, how would I develop a tour? I'm still the apprentice, if you like, but I think, how would I develop a tour in for this subject or that subject? Where would I go? Which places would I go? How can I connect these places? How can you go from A to B without, you know? I think this is very, very, this is fun. This is, but also a lot of work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is a lot of work, especially when you get to the research stage.
Yeah.
Because as a guide, you always research too much.
Yeah.
You get too much material, and then you have to cut it down.
Yeah.
But the things you don't use, of course, you keep them, because you can use them later on in another tour.
Yeah, sure.
So you always recycle what you don't use.
Yeah.
But inevitably, as you will know, when you start researching something, an idea will come to you, and you follow that line and that line, as they say, going down the rabbit hole, as it were, finding out new things. And so it can be quite labor intensive.
Yeah.
But interesting in the same way.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we talked about it. You have a wide variety of topics. You do a lot of tours. I did a Charles Dickens tour with you. I did a Shakespeare tour with you. For example, these are just two of your tours. But this series is called Talks Beyond Time and Place, and we both share an interest in Peter Ackroyd and in his view of London.
That's right.
What all his works have in common is that they feature the city of London as a powerful presence, not only as a setting, but more like a character, actually, in his works. And he also has a very interesting view on time in London, I think, how time works in London. He often mentions the topographical imperative or territorial imperative, and I'm going to quote him now. He says, "In my opinion, people are affected by location. I have a phrase, territorial imperative, by which a street, an alley, a house, and the inhabitants thereof are deeply infected by the nature of the terrain and by the history of the terrain beneath their feet." And he also says what most fascinates him about London and its history is its power, its majesty, its darkness, and its shadows. And I can agree with that. I think you can agree with that too, especially with your knowledge and the way you perceive London yourself. And I think we could probably talk about Ackroyd for hours, but I also think that these subjects are featured on your tour, Peter Ackroyd's Monstrous East End. So the first question would be, how exactly did you come up with this tour?
Well, I was actually reviewing a book for the Literary London Society about Ackroyd's London novels. And as I was reading through, I noticed that the writer had concentrated a lot on aspects of the East End that were appearing in Ackroyd's novels. It's called A Horror and a Beauty. And I thought, I'd been thinking for some time about how I could do an Ackroyd tour, but wasn't sure whereabouts in London I should set it. And as I was reading through the work for reviewing it, I thought, well, yeah, there's a common thread that's running through of this dark side of the monsters that are located there. It's not uniformly dark. I mean, for instance, in the house of Dr. D, the East End is quite positive. That's where D locates the mythical original London in Wapping Marshes
Mhm.
underneath. And that's where he goes down and finds the mystic city universal, where all are reconciled. I mean, there's a lot of darkness in the House of Dr. D, but it's a very positive novel
Yeah,
about, as I say, reconciliation and bridge building and so on.
yeah,
But I initially started including that in the tour and found out it was just too long, so
yeah,
I had to cut that out and concentrate on the dark stuff instead.
yeah,
But yeah, so that's essentially how it came about. I was wanting to do an Ackroyd tour, but it was a question of where to put it and what to use.
yeah.
So yes, it was reviewing that book that gave me the focus, and went on from there.
Yeah, and I think it's a brilliant tour. And as you said earlier, this is another. It's again this thing. How do I connect places? How can I go from A to B? And what can I tell? What do I include? What do I leave out? And so the focus is on the monstrous East End. And the novels that you include are Hawksmoor, Danlino and the Limehouse Golem, and the Casebook of Victor Frankenstein.
That's correct.
And,
Yeah.
and it starts in Limehouse, and I think as I said, I can relate to this area, and I can relate to this perception of London very much. And I think what's interesting, I already said this, is Ackroyd's perception of time, how the concept of time in London, and how he presents it in his novels. In Hawksmoor, for example, he mirrors I think it's the 18th century and the 20th century with his two main protagonists, Nicholas Dyer and Nicholas Hawksmoor. And what I found interesting is that in Hawksmoor and in his other novels too, he uses the figure of the tramp, the vagrant, who basically stands outside of time. And I think you wrote an article called the trope of the tramp about this topic.
Yes.
For the London Literary Society, for the online journal. And what would you say, what exactly is so important about Ackroyd's tramp, and what is the trope of the tramp for him?
Well, the tramp or the vagrant, Ackroyd takes them as an example of a class of person which is outside society. It's outside the norms, the fashions of society. They have their own way of living, their own way of getting by, and their own perspective. And he sees in the vagrant a kind of eternal figure. It's like the saying, the Jesus saying, the poor are always with us. And the vagrant is always with us. There are always victims of society. As Ackroyd points out, London is a glorious place, but it's also a kind of cannibalistic monster that eats the people that make it up. And vagrants are part of those that class of victims. And in Hawksmoor, he actually depicts the vagrants as the guardians of London's character and its history. And when Nicholas Dyer is heading for the building site of St. Anne Limehouse, he compares them to the ancient Britons from before the Romans. And they are this perpetual class of person. And if you read the Plato papers, when Plato goes down below his current level and reaches the 20th century in a lower level of ground, the vagrants there are special. They are seen as almost mystical people. And we mentioned the house of Dr. D. Well, when D finally goes down at Wapping Marsh down to the mystical city universal, he meets Jennings, who is the vagrant that he met earlier in his own garden. But now Jennings is the man who welcomes D into this eternal city where everyone, as I say, is reconciled and so on. So they are, for Ackroyd, they're the keepers of London's character. And they are the eternal, or part of the eternal nature of London.
Definitely, They, as you said it, they are the eternal figure in a way. and also the tramp is the victim. You said that. So would you agree with this idea that the tramp is the victim of London?
Oh, very much so. As I say, Ackroyd is very clear that although he does celebrate London as a perpetual place, a shining place that that outfaces time, but nevertheless he is keenly aware of the nature of London as a place that has its victims. It feeds on its own body, as it were, the people that make up London.
Yeah.
And the Vagrant is a classic example of that. And in Hawksmoor, to come back to Hawksmoor, where we see the vagrant Ned, who comes to London from Bristol in the 1720s and the 1980s to become the second victim at Limehouse. And in the chapter 4, which is the one in the 1980s, we actually see Ned's descent from being a respectable middle-class person in Bristol to becoming a vagrant on the streets of London. And he goes amongst the other vagrants, and we see how even amongst themselves they victimize each other and prey on each other and so on. And we can see his mental process as his mind deteriorates. And as you know, ultimately he becomes the second victim of presumably the architect in the 20th century.
That's true.
Yeah, I mean, they very much are the victims of society too, as well as being the, as it were, the mystical keepers of its nature, or probably because of that.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I mean, there's also the dance in Rope Makers Fields with the wheel that turn it ever. You mentioned that, so they don't move. They, as you said, they represent eternal London, and they don't move. They don't move through time linear, but cyclical, and I like this idea. And I mean, the vagrant is also a walker, a wanderer, and walking is very important in Ackroyd's works. I mean, the protagonists in Hawksmoor, Nicholas Dyer and Nicholas Hawksmoor, they both walk the streets of London in different times. And I think for both of them, it's a very positive experience at first, and then it turns into a very dark experience. The characters in the Limehouse Golem, they walk the streets. Would you say that walking London, or maybe the walking London turns Ackroyd's protagonists into monsters?
I don't think it necessarily turns them into monsters. I think what it does is engages them more with London, and then they react in the necessary way. So Matthew Palmer in The House of Dr. D, he spends a lot of time walking around trying to find Dee. His quest to find Dee becomes the equivalent of Dee's quest to find the mythical London at Wapping. But he learns the truth about his father, the truth about his mother and their relationship and so on, and comes to a harmonious conclusion. He comes to appreciate his mother, the mother that previously he thought hated him and that he kept at arm's length. And then he realizes how much she protected him and how much she loved him and still loves him and so on. So it's... to use the well-worn phrase, it's a voyage of discovery. It's a way that you engage with your surroundings, and then you can become a monster, or you can become a celebrant of London and its times. So Nicholas Dyer, at the beginning of Hawksmoor, as a child, as you know, he walks around a lot, and he engages with old London. He finds the broken sundial, the broken gnomon, and in a sense I sort of read that as a symbol that the sundial which tells the time is broken, and so it can't tell the time because place conquers time.
Right.
And so a lesson that he learns through walking, but it's only because he's taken in by this mystical cult on Blackstep Lane that's where he learns to fear the ancient terrors. And that obviously informs his building project and leads to the murders.
Right.
So yeah, it can go either way, basically.
It can go either way, and I mean, you're a tour guide, you're a walker too, and you deal with literature. So I don't think it necessarily turned people into monsters. But another aspect that's important in Ackroyd's London is the theatre. I mean, the theatre is in itself, it's a big part of London's history and London's character, if you like. But what he also often connects is a theatre with crime and murder, the theatricality of crime and murder. In Lino and the Limehouse Golem, I think it's interesting. Ackroyd, he includes historical figures like Karl Marx and George Gissing and people like that. And I think he lets Karl Marx, he lets him say that the Jew and the whore are the scapegoats in the desert of London because they are the victims of these murders.
There's only one Jewish victim, which is Solomon Weil, but he's a victim by accident.
Right,
because the killer wanted to kill Karl Marx and cut off the top of his head to see his brain with all the ideas inside. But the killer thinks that Marx lives in Limehouse and doesn't realize that Marx is only coming to Limehouse to visit Solomon Weil, that Marx lives in Soho. So it's an accidental killing, as it were. So it's not the same as the prostitute killings. But of course, without spoiling the novel for anyone who hasn't read it, the person who is the golem actually commits other murders as well. There are some performers who are killed, for instance, and there's a domestic murder carried out as well. So I won't go any further than that. But so that the golem killings are just part of the overall total of murders committed by the killer.
What I also find interesting in this context, but we won't go into detail because, as you said, anybody who hasn't read it might want to find out themselves. Is the kind of blurring between male and female in the novel, or in generally in Ackroyd's novels. You know, I can say the prison director who puts on a dead woman's gown right at the beginning, or Dan Lino himself who plays women on stage. And I think this is also an interesting feature in Ackroyd's novels.
Absolutely. Some years ago, Ackroyd did actually publish a study of transvestism called Dressing Up. And in English Music, the novel where the young boy Timothy Harkham, living in London with his father, who is a spirit medium, but going to the country where his mother's parents are, and he, as it were, brings back his mother through creative imagination, as it were, and part of that involves him putting on her dress and playing her mandolin. And so this question of identification through becoming another character by putting on clothing and so on. And of course, in Dan Lino, you get the character of Lambeth Marsh Lizzie, the female at the beginning of the novel, who falls in love with the stage and ends up becoming an assistant to Dan Lino. And she creates a male character on stage. It works in both directions. But this idea of performance is very much at the heart of Ackroyd's stuff. I mean, that's why he's written biographies of who is it now? Charlie Chaplin and Hitchcock, of course, for the great film director. But this whole idea of performance is very much an Ackroydian thing. And he has often been sort of put in the sort of postmodern category, that he's a postmodern writer, so he sort of revises what's gone before. But that's too narrow a category to put him in. He's more a performer. He creates, as has been said a lot of time, he creates the pastiche. So Hawksmoor is a pastiche of a detective novel, because it isn't actually a real detective novel, even though you've got a detective looking for crimes. The Plato Papers is a pastiche of a science fiction novel. And you will find reviews online where people have read, say, the Plato Papers. This is a terrible novel. It doesn't obey the rules of science fiction at all. I said, well, it's not supposed to. It's Ackroyd being a science fiction writer.
Right.
He's playing with the audience, but not to mock them. It's a game he wants them to join in with.
Yeah.
So, performance is very much at the heart of his work.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting that Charlie Chaplin is in a kind of way he's even included in Lino and the Limehouse Golem, but we don't want to go too far. What did you think of the movie, of the film? Did you watch it? Did you like it? The Limehouse Golem?
Oh yes, it was. Obviously, it was very well done and very well performed. The trouble with watching a film of a book that you know is you have to watch it again and again, because the first time you watch it, you can't enjoy the film. You'll say, well, how is he doing this? How is he doing that? Well, what's happened there?
Yeah.
And the central police character, played by Bill Nighy, as you will know, in the novel, is quite a minor character.
Right, yeah.
So they've had to turn the story inside out. It does lose some of the delicacy. For instance, the series of murders, a lot of them you just see in flashback. So you lose a lot of significance.
Right.
Of course, you see the murder of Solomon Weil, but you don't understand the whole thing about the golem with the penis put on the book, because you don't see the penis because it's a film. And but you do see the book that although of course the illustration is William Blake's
Ghost of
the Soul of the Flea. It's not a picture of the golem. So, it's like problem with continuity there.
Right, but
but it is an enjoyable film.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's just like you just said, to make it a movie, they had to kind of turn it into a real detective story, although the book isn't. So that's basically the thing. Another thing, you wrote another article for the Modern Language Review, I think, about the Casebook of Victor Frankenstein, and called Peter Ackroyd's Imaginary Projections, a context for the creature of the Casebook of Victor Frankenstein. Again, we don't want to say too much for those who haven't read it. Why do you think Ackroyd set the Frankenstein story in London, apart from it being a typical Ackroydian thing to do that?
Well, I think largely that's at the heart of it. Ackroyd's work really is, I think, about celebrating and understanding London.
Yeah.
I mean, he does enjoy writing, the creative process, and he can write decent work that's not set in London. For instance, First Light, one of his earlier novels, which is set in the West Country, in the countryside, which is a really good read. It's a good story, and it works very well. And it also, again, expounds Ackroyd's ideas about time, and also about the human community and continuity.
Yeah.
So he can set things outside London if he wants to, but I think maybe that drive now to understand London has become too much of an imperative for him. It's too much of a compulsion.
Yeah.
And so to understand things properly, he brings the action to London. I mean, as you know, it starts in Switzerland, but then he brings Frankenstein to Oxford University, which it could be practicality as a way of getting him here, but I think as well it's because that way he can meet Percy Shelley.
Right, yeah.
And of course Mary Shelley being the wife of Percy Shelley and the creator of Frankenstein. So the character meets his creator.
Right.
What they call a metafictional moment, which again is very Ackroydian, part of the play.
Right.
The game, as it were, that he plays with his work.
Yeah. Yeah, he often the boundaries between reality and fiction, they don't really exist for him. And I also like this idea, because I think in a kind of way literature is also a good way of getting to know London. I like this attempt of doing this. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, for instance, in the House of Dr. Dee, where he brings Dee's house from Mortlake in Surrey into Clerkenwell, Ackroyd is not afraid to mix things up.
Right.
So in Hawksmoor, we have Nicholas Dyer being born in a house in a court of a brick lane in the East End, whereas he's the fictional counterpart of Nicholas Hawksmoor, who wasn't born in London and grew up with a perfectly normal family life, as opposed to Nicholas Dyer, who falls among this, as I say, this cult based on Blackstep Lane. So Ackroyd is more than happy to twist details, historical details, but in that way he creates something new.
Right.
And for Ackroyd, it seems that imaginative reality is just as valid as actuality, because you can experience both and you can learn from both.
Right. Right.
Imaginative
Definitely.
projection is just taking ideas further.
Yeah, that's true. That's really true. So why do you think Ackroyd places his monsters in the East End? I mean, the novels are mostly set in the East End, in Limehouse, for example.
Yes, it's an interesting point. It's a curious point. I mean, the thing is, I think it's this Ackroydian thing that, you know, you have the different parts of London that have their own characters and reflect what's been happening over time, and this is mentioned, you know, explicitly by Ackroyd at various points, especially in the House of Dr. D. And I think that the thing with the East End, it's always been, as it were, a sort of a symbol of criminality. And even though crime obviously is committed throughout London, there's always been something about the East End. And I think especially because of the Ripper murders, as you say, and before them, the Ratcliffe Highway murders, but also the Krays and so on. There were other gangs in the 60s and the 50s, but the Krays were the most ambitious. And so they became the celebrity criminals. And again, the focus on the East End. So that, and also the radical aspect of the East End, various movements that have been born down there, and, you know, political and philosophical. And of course, Emanuel Swedenborg, the great theologian and philosopher, he lived in the East End on Well Close Square, and was buried at the Swedish church on Prince's Square, which was sadly demolished in the 1930s.
Swedenborg Gardens, right?
That's correct. There's what was Prince's Square, but then it was flattened by the Greater London Council in the late 1960s. But there's always been that sort of aspect of unrest. I think as well because of the way that the East End is populated, because it's a mixture of both immigrant populations, but also the people who have been, as it were, the workforce. So as London started to expand with increasing amounts of cargo transport coming in, maritime trade, of course, the expansion has to go downriver. And on the Thames, downriver is east. And so you get the shipping industry down there, then the wharves and the docks and so on. And so you get the cheap labor coming in. And as you all know, dock workers did not have regular work. They turned up in the morning and either they got work for the day or they didn't. So only truly desperate people would go and work down in areas like that. And so on. So you get the hard workers, the more desperate type of person, and also the immigrant population, which themselves have their own, you know, unsettled situation. So possibly because of that. Although that's pure speculation on my part.
Well,
I haven't actually read any statements by him.
I mean, we've talked about Ackroyd and his monsters now, and a bit about the question if London is the real monster or London creates these monsters. But in the beginning, I also mentioned that you also write your own stories, and you published some books. And one, for example, is this short story collection, Death in the City. And in these stories, I mean, the title already says it, you deal with the topic of death, or rather with the connection of death and life in London, or rather with the ever-existing presence of death and the dead in London. So how and why did you start writing yourself? Or how and when, rather?
Yeah. The thing about the dead is of course, they're everywhere in London. It's only, historically, it's only relatively late that we get the big cemeteries on what were the edges of London in the 1800s. But before then, the burial grounds were all mixed in with everything else. And so all around you, you've got little green squares and small parks and so on. I mean, just literally next to where I am now is a former cemetery, which is now a park. It was the Victoria Park Cemetery. And since 1893, it's been the Meath Gardens Park. And, excuse me, you know, they're all around. And as you would expect from a city that's as old as London. And so it just sort of occurred to me that really the dead, they're just the people that were here before. We're the people who are here now, and there will be other people coming along. And as I've said a lot of times, to me, history, and especially the story of London, it's just a continuous story, and we just happen to be in these chapters at the moment. You know, the history isn't the past, it's just part of an ongoing story. So it just, you know, the closeness of the living and the dead seemed to me to be an obvious expression of that fact that we are part of the continuity, which again is a very big theme in Ackroyd's work too.
Yeah, definitely. Why did you choose to write short stories and not a novel, for example?
Well, I think it was just a question of practicality, really. I just wanted to exercise styles, because each of the stories is written in a different style. And a different, so some of them are fairly serious, some of them are fairly comic, and as you say, some of them are a bit Ackroydian as well. But the other thing as well is I wanted to write about things that I knew about. So I didn't want to sit down and go searching for what would make a good story. I thought, well, what do I know already from having grown up in London? So things like the Necropolis Railway and theatre ghosts and so on. These are things that I've learnt about as I've grown up. So I thought, well, translate that into stories. So that's essentially how that one came about.
I see, and I understand the idea behind it. So I can recommend it for all the audiences who are watching. I can recommend it. So it's a great collection of short stories. I've prepared one or two questions to finish off our conversation, if that's okay for you.
Certainly.
The first question would be, what is your favorite place in London? Or do you have a favorite place in London?
The city I like. I've always liked the city, I think, because it's so compact. It's a good place to get lost in and wander around.
Definitely,
and that sort of thing, Although I am very fond of Hyde Park. I think it's a nice place to walk around, especially in the autumn and late autumn or winter, when obviously all the leaves are falling and stuff. And there's a police force called the Royal Parks Constabulary, and they have a little police station there. And you can walk around in the cold of the winter and the dark, and you see the lights on in there, and you think how snug and warm it would be in there. So I find that rather pleasing. So yes, I do like walking around Hyde Park. And St James's Park as well, I think, is probably the most beautiful park I know. And I've got to know that a lot more since guiding Italian and Spanish school groups, because inevitably they want to go around Westminster and they want to go to Buckingham Palace. So you have to go through the park. But because of that, and also now because of the Secret Service tours I do, we go through St James's Park. And it's a marvellous place because of the varying shrubs and flowering shrubs and trees and so on, and the different types of bird they have and things. It's a really nice place to be. But it's very difficult to pin anything down. A lot of it depends on your mood, I suppose.
has dealing with London and its history and its literature changed your view of the city, or walking the city? Has this changed your view on the city?
Changed in the sense of deepened, yes. It's taught me more. I've learned to appreciate it more. I've become more aware as well of what I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, even in the city, I've done so many tours in the city, but there are still pockets of the city I don't know.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be able to take someone around, say, Austin Friars on the northeastern part of the city, or the lanes off of Fleet Street. And I wouldn't be able to guide them there because I don't know, because I haven't been there. So guiding has become a useful tool, actually. They're right, well, I'll do a tour there. And so you actually get to know it. And then by the time you've prepared your tour, you've become familiar with the place. So it's increasing and deepening my appreciation of London.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it hasn't changed in the sense of making a negative attitude positive or the other way around. I still like the place. Although I have to say that you get a lot of guides who are, oh, London is the most wonderful city in the world, and I love London and stuff like that. And usually they're people who don't come from London. They've come into London either from other parts of the country or from other countries.
Yeah.
Whereas to me, it's just home.
Yeah, right. Sure.
I'm sure there are other cities that are just as good. I'm sure New York and Berlin and Paris are just as interesting.
Right. Yeah.
But
each in their own
probably
way.
Heresy for me to say that as a tour guide. But to me, I don't have that that view of London. As I say, it's just home. It's where I was born, where I've grown up.
I see what you mean.
Yeah. So I don't so much love it like a lover. I love it like a brother.
Right. Yeah, that's a nice statement. But there's still places to explore. There's always more to find out.
Oh yes. Yeah. Geographically and thematically as well, or historically. You can know an area and then but not know interesting stories, and then you find them out and you think, oh, actually, yes, that is more interesting than I thought.
Yeah, that's good. That's nice. Yeah, I think this will never stop. So you will never get bored there. What I last but not least, the final question actually is, can you name 3 Londoners that you would love to have dinner with or a drink with from throughout history?
Well, it would have to be Shakespeare.
Yeah,
of course. Trouble is, I wouldn't want to pick 3 writers. I could pick 3 writers easily, but Shakespeare, probably Richard Whittington. Whittington. I'd like to speak to him and spend some time with him. Well, a 3rd Londoner. I mean, there are so many possibles. Probably Churchill.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting choice. Yeah. That would be interesting to, talk to.
I mean, they're all strong characters in their own way.
Right.
So they would have interesting things to say, as it were.
Definitely.
But also, they are figures that represent different aspects of London.
Definitely, yeah.
As well. So So I'll go with those 3. Thank you.
All right, I'll note it down and I'll let them know. So
yeah, thank you. I think they all appreciate a drink as well. So
yes, definitely, yeah. So I think we've come to the end. Thank you very much, Dave, for this wonderful conversation. I think you have a virtual tour coming now, basically, or in about an hour, right?
In an hour.
Yeah.
Which one? Just under an hour.
Is it?
Oh, it's secret writing. This is the secret agents in literature. So George Smiley and James Bond, of course, but some others as well, and some of them which I always hope are a surprise for the audience.
Certainly, probably yes, yeah. So yeah, depending on how this series will develop, I would love to have you back for another conversation, maybe on another topic. We'll see.
Absolutely.
If you, dear audience, are interested, go and visit David's tours. They're wonderful, and he offers them virtually. And do you offer them in person right now, or only virtually?
Not at the moment.
Okay.
At the moment, I'm too busy converting existing tours to virtual ones.
Yeah.
So I'm focusing on that at the moment.
Okay, so you've heard him. And if you're interested in his writing, go to his website, and he also has a blog on Footprints of London. You all write in this blog, I think, but
Absolutely.
he's got some articles there, got some essays there. I'm going to put a link for his websites into the description below. Also going to put the link to some of the articles and some of the topics we talked about into the description. So thank you very much, David. I'm really happy that this worked up to now.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, and I hope to see you soon, maybe in real life again, but definitely on screen.
Absolutely.
All right.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Phil.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye for now.